these last few weeks is you to show me that you've been learning by me trying to show you how to do your own study, effectively doing your own research into the material, doing the homework. If you guys are ready, trust me. So while I'm here for you to help you solve problems, and I will return emails, and I will be at office hours even during study week, getting ready to turn the tables over to you and let you guys start taking off. I mean, I didn't actually calculate the mean, I forgot to do that, but there's no question there was huge improvement on this exam for many of you. So on average, it was dramatic. Okay, so right now we're engaged in understanding metabolism. So let's just go over again in brief what we're trying to accomplish. So first of all, we're trying to understand the physiology of metabolism at the molecular level, right? So, in a grand scheme, you'd have to be insane to not appreciate how important these pathways are that we're studying. I mean, we're effectively learning how fuel that we consume is converted into the energy that enables life. That's what we're going to be doing all the way through to the end of the semester. And often, one of those questions is going to be, would you like to share some salad with the rest of the class? We're interested in fundamental questions about those enzymes. How are those enzymes specific for their substrates? For instance, hexokinase is an enzyme that catalyzes the first step in glycolysis, and it's specific for glucose. I think that metabolism would get messed up in a big way if that enzyme was also able to bind to similar sugars that are not on the pathway of glycolysis. Similarly, we're interested in understanding how these enzymes are not wasteful, meaning how are these enzymes able to ensure that if we're going to be utilizing free energy by coupling the hydrolysis of ATP to an unfavorable reaction, how do we ensure that every single time that phosphoryl transfer goes to our substrate and not just to wasteful hydrolysis? And similarly, we're interested in how do these enzymes ensure that during the reaction, when intermediates are being generated, that if they were to be released from the enzyme, could potentially cause harm to the cell, could potentially cause mutations to DNA. How is that kept at bay? And then second to last, we're fundamentally interested in the mechanism of action of these enzymes. In other words, how do they lower the activation energy barrier at the molecular level? What are the tools in the active site that enable life to occur at the molecular level? And then last but not least, how is all of this regulated and controlled? In other words, for glycolysis, if we are in a situation where we have been asleep for 8 hours and our bodies have now switched over to synthesizing glucose, called gluconeogenesis, how do we ensure that the enzymes that participate in glycolysis are shut off? Because it would just be a vicious cycle of just generating glucose that we need, that our brains need to survive during our pleasant dreams, versus taking that precious glucose and just turning it back into pyruvate. Right? How is that accomplished? So these are the things that we all need to be thinking about as we explore metabolism. Okay, so we stopped on Thursday at the mechanism of action of a really interesting enzyme called triose-phosphate isomerase. It catalyzes the interconversion of dihydroxyacetone phosphate and glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, or GAP, from one to the other. remember, this is a reversible reaction, and even though what is on the pathway of glycolysis is conversion of DHAP into GAP, we have to remember that the enzyme doesn't have the ability to discriminate one of those molecules from the other, right? And so the enzyme is just going to bind to whatever it bumps into, and then will catalyze the reaction. All right, and so let's get back on track by doing this learning check. So the reaction that we're talking about has a positive delta G value, but it's only mildly positive. In fact, let's look it up. Let's put that value in there. And in fact, there's this wonderful table in your book called Table 16.1 where we can look up these things. And so here it is. We have it, 7.5. Oh, no, that's delta G, yeah. 7.5 is not 0. Let's go back to that learning check. So that actually tells me that GAP is slightly higher in free energy than is DHAP. In fact, you can even tell me now. You guys know how to do this. So if this is the case, how is it then that GAP can be produced by this reaction for use in subsequent glycolytic reactions? And so, of course, this learning check is trying to drill into your memory that the real equation we need when considering these types of questions is delta G, not delta G naught prime. Delta G naught prime is a free energy change for a very special circumstance where we're starting with equal concentrations of product and substrate at 1 molar and allowing equilibrium to be achieved. On the other hand, delta G can be calculated for any concentration using this formula. And so even if we put plus 7.5 kilojoules per mole, we can see that the delta G will become negative if this term is more negative than 7.5 kilojoules per mole. And the way that's going to work is when the concentration of GAP is significantly lower than the concentration of DHAP. And that's one of the magical things about metabolic pathways, is that there's an enzyme that we're going to start talking about this morning called GAP dehydrogenase that will start consuming GAP during glycolysis. And that consumption of GAP is going to keep GAP levels low relative to DHAP. And that's called the Ch16.2 principle. And that's how a metabolic pathway can drive the formation of product even when we have reactions in the pathway that have positive delta G naught prime values. Okay. Now I want to talk about how do we get from GAP to pyruvate. This is one of the very few circumstances where I'm cool with that arrow. This is not a reaction. This is just showing schematically that we're going to go from here to here. I need my glasses. I have something. So let's go through and talk about how this is going to work. I want to refresh your memories about table 15.1 because this table was useful for seeing whether phosphoryl transfer reactions between these biologically relevant molecules is going to be energetically favorable or not. And what we see is that this molecule here, which is going to be the first product in the payback phase of glycolysis, has a much higher free energy of hydrolysis than does ATP. That tells me that the delta G naught prime for the phosphoryl transfer from 1,3-BPG the ATP is going to be significantly favorable. It's going to be significantly negative. So if we can generate 1 ppg, then we have power now to generate ATP. Please recall that we've already burned 2 ATP in stage 1. The first reaction, catalyzed by hexokinase, phosphorylates glucose at the 6-carbon OH position. And then phosphofructokinase phosphorylates fructose 6-phosphate at the 1-carbon to generate fructose 1,6-bisphosphate. So we're already 2 ATP'd in the hole, and so finally we're going to start seeing some payback. So here's the reaction. Now let me tell you something. Going from this molecule to this molecule, in and of itself, is energetically unfavorable. This, whatever we call this bond, phospho something or other, is a high energy bond, right, that we know how much free energy is generated when you hydrolyze it. It was like almost minus 50 kilojoules per mole, right? So we know that generating a high energy bond is going to be energetically unfavorable. And this is where energy coupling is going to come into play. So notice that I've got a nice reduced carbon right here with this CH covalent bond. So the oxidation of that CH bond is going to release a ton of energy, right? So you can think of this in terms of my gasoline analogy. If I take a bucket of gasoline, I light a match, and I throw it in there, it's going to be impressive. But not really any work was done, right? Basically, it released a ton of heat, and it was exciting. Whereas if I take that gallon of gas and put it in your cars, you guys are going to be able to push that giant machine, depending on what you have, anywhere between 15 to maybe 40 miles for those of you who are styling in an eco-friendly car, right? So that's what we're going to do, is we're going to couple the free energy that's released upon the oxidation of this molecule to generate this molecule. And that's what I want to show you today when we look at the enzyme mechanism of action of GAP dehydrogenase. And notice that in this case we also have 2 other substrates. We have inorganic phosphate. That makes sense. We know we have to get phosphate from somewhere to put it on here. But we also have this cofactor NAD+. And so NAD+ is going to get reduced. So let's get the terminology down here. It's going to become reduced in the form of NADH. And this is going to become oxidized. And this is important because NADH is not just some molecule, right? It's actually the fuel for the stuff we're going to study in chapter 18 that's ultimately responsible for generating that proton gradient in mitochondria, which is ultimately responsible for generating ATP. Important stuff here. Right, so this slide is just summarizing what I said. This reaction right here releases a ton of energy. This reaction is energetically unfavorable, so if we can somehow couple them, we're going to end up with a reaction with an equilibrium constant that's about 1. They balance each other out. All right, so here it is. Glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate dehydrogenase. And look at what I've got in the active site. I've got my good friend, and then I've got my 2 favorite residues. Ridiculous. What residue is that? Wrong. Cysteine. Have I ever said that serine is my favorite residue? Never. But it's not bad. It's a nice residue. This is my friend histidine. So clearly there's going to be some nucleophilic action going on. We know That's kind of the power of cysteine, is that it can act as a nucleophile if it's deprotonated. And then our good friend histidine is almost always going to be involved in acid-base catalysis when it's down in the active site. And then, so they're basically just redrawing our substrate, glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, where R represents everything except the aldehyde. So we're basically just going to focus on what happens to the aldehyde. So we're going to deprotonate. So the SH will deprotonate to form the thiolate anion. They're not showing us how that occurs, but one can imagine that there's some residue there that's acting as a base. And what we've learned so far is that that residue can be, it can be a histidine, it can be glue or acid. In some cases, it can even be a serine residue. Remember, in the mechanism of myosin, serine residue was ultimately activating that water molecule. So there's a lot of things that can act as acids and bases, but overwhelmingly, at least in this book, the examples are histidine, glue, and acid. I'll even just go ahead and put a base there. I'll go ahead and grab that proton. Then I'm going to have that thiolate anion, and it's going to go ahead and attack that carbon. This should look pretty familiar to you guys. So now I've got something that's looking a lot like a transition state, where I've got this formal negative charge on the oxygen. So we all know how the enzyme is going to deal with that, don't we? Yeah, it's going to stabilize it somehow. It probably has something that's going to stabilize that negative charge. Then what's going to happen is that it actually, so they're skipping steps here, which is annoying. So magically a proton appears. Let's write that in. I'm going to have over here an acid. Yeah. Gap deprotonates the cysteine residue. How would that work?
So,
because it looks to me, I have to go really fast today, so I'm gonna drive. You may be right, but what I don't like about that is I've got this oxygen way over here, and I've got my proton over here. They're not in proximity. That just doesn't make sense to me. Furthermore, there's no way that, because if I put a proton on here, I'm going to have something that looks like that, which probably is unlikely to occur.
it would, when it gets negative, it would, if the proton diffuses, it would.
The proton is already gone. Are you talking about the proton here?
So PL would attack carbon, oxygen would become negative, and then.
So you're saying this is where the proton comes from?
Yes.
Maybe. It's possible, but again, these things have to be near one another. In this case, my intuition tells me that there's going to be another acid involved, but you could be right. I mean, absolutely. But the way I'm going to draw it is a little bit different. So I'll call this base 1. Call this acid 2. And I'm just going to have the electrons come in. Now, this guy. And so now what's going to happen is that imidazole on the histidine is going to deprotonate, and it's going to cause reformation of the the C double bond O and what we call hydride transfer to NAD plus. Oops, sorry. So this is NAD plus. And so what is a hydride ion? Very simply this. It's a hydrogen atom with an extra electron. And so when that occurs, so I've got this, grab this electron from here, this goes to NAD plus. Now I'm going to form your good friend. What is this called? They forget so quickly. Thank you, Lana. This is the thioester bond. Thioester bonds are remarkable because they have relatively high free energy, meaning that their hydrolysis releases a lot of energy, meaning delta G, not prime, for the hydrolysis of this thing was around minus 30 kilojoules per mole. All of that in chapter 16. So why am I making a big deal about this? Because this high energy bond can do stuff, you know, and so what we're going to see is that normally a phosphoryl group attacking a carbonyl carbon is just not going to fly, not going to be favorable. But when it attacks a thioester, the reaction is going to be okay because the free energy of those bonds are relatively the same. In other words, the free energy of the thioester intermediate, the enzyme, we can call this an enzyme acyl intermediate, by the way. Someone should check me on that. I'm not 100% sure with the sulfur, if that's okay. But if we can't call it an enzyme acyl intermediate, I'll just call it an enzyme thioester intermediate. I like that better anyways. So the free energy of the thioester, the enzyme intermediate, is about equivalent as that phosphoryl bond to 1,3-BPG between carbon 1 and phosphate. And so here we are, we now have our protonated histidine. What do you guys think the pKa of this should be then? Someone just said 14, which I'm not so happy about. Okay. 6 to 7. I mean, how about we just say it's probably close to physiological pH, right? Because as we're about to see, this proton is eventually going to leave. We have to regenerate the enzyme, right? The enzyme has to be returning to the state that we found it in so it can catalyze more reactions. All right, so we have NADH. I've got this protonated histidine. I've got this thioester intermediate. Let's see what happens next. So what's going to happen is the NADH is going to leave. Dissociates from the enzyme. And interestingly, before anything happens, an NAD plus is going to replace it. Then what happens is the phosphoryl group will come in. And that phosphoryl group is going to bind in proximity to the thioester bond. The phosphate group is somehow going to be activated so that it's nucleophilic. And that nucleophile is going to attack and then the enzyme is returned to its original state. They're really skipping a lot of steps here, right? I mean, here we have the protonated histidine, and somehow that protonated histidine is returning to its normal state. I mean, maybe Natalia got it right, and she is like, hey, well, we can just get that proton to reprotonate the cysteine sulfhydryl. I mean, it's hard to tell in 2 dimensions, right? You know, we could go to the PDB and look it up, you know, which would be fun for me. What's up, Hasa? You went like this.
Yeah, but I was just saying that it's pretty common to
It might, but remember, it's also possible that there was a base here that's going to pick that up. So we can imagine that as long as this base here is toggling back and forth with the histidine, that histidine is eventually going to be protonated, right? And then it's going to deprotonate. And when it's deprotonated, that's a good thing, right? Because that deprotonated histidine can then accept a proton from one of our intermediates. But then that base here can pick up the proton again. Yeah.
So the book didn't make it really clear, but what's the purpose of NAD? Is it recruiting the PI?
The positive charge somehow stabilizes the transition state.
Okay.
And we can imagine that, again, they don't go into detail, but what does this transition state look like? It's going to look like this.
Negative charge and oxygen gap.
Maybe NAD plus serves to lower the activation energy barrier. They leave a lot open, which I like, because then we get to use our imaginations and speculate. So I had a model where I'm involving 2 bases. You have a model where there's only one, but you know, that's what's cool about biochemistry is we could go after the conference to the bar and duke it out, try to see who's right, maybe do an experiment. Okay, so let's summarize this now using a free energy diagram. And so the first free energy diagram on the left is showing what happens when we're not coupling phosphoryl transfer to generate 1,3-BPG. We're only oxidizing gap. And what we see is that the free energy is going to drop tremendously because in this case, we're going from gap to, what was it, 3-phosphoglycerate maybe? And so the oxidation of gap is going to release a bunch of energy. And so that's why we can write the free energy diagram this way. But if we try to phosphorylate 3-phosphoglycerate to get 1,3-BPG, we have this tremendous uphill battle where it's just not going to happen without an input of energy somewhere. So this thing right here is just dead. Not going to result in a successful metabolic pathway because you're never really going to get 1,3-BPG. And if anything, this metabolic pathway really sucks because we already invested 2 ATP, we haven't gotten anything yet. Now let's look at the coupled situation. So we go from gap, NAD plus, to the thioester intermediate NADH. Now, we're not releasing really any free energy here because the free energy of oxidation of gap is basically just converted into the high free energy of the thioester bond. That's why we would show the KEQ here is roughly 1. Because the free energy of the thioester bond is similar to the free energy of this reduced molecule gap. Then the thioester intermediate reacts with phosphate, generating 1,3-BPG. And again, the KEQ here is around 1 as well. Because the free energy of 1,3-DPG is really equivalent to the free energy of that thioester intermediate between our substrate intermediate and the active site cysteine residue. So we're basically just converting energy from one chemical form to another that all have roughly the same energy at this point. But you guys know now why this is awesome, because 1,3-DPG is next going to be utilized to generate ATP. And we know that for one glucose, I'm going to generate 2 1,3-DPGs. Because when fructose 1,6-bisphosphate is cleaved, it's going to generate DHAP and GAP, and that DHAP is eventually converted into GAP, right? Let's look at the next reaction. Oh, before we do that, I like the way they say this here, so if you're still confused, let's see if book terminology works for you. So how is energy coupling working at the molecular level? How is GAP dehydrogenase performing energy coupling? The key is an intermediate formed as a result of the aldehyde oxidation that is linked to the enzyme by a thioester bond. The thioester intermediate is higher in free energy than the free carboxylic acid is. So that free carboxylic acid was what would have happened if we just oxidized GAP without actually going through this energy coupling process. And so we say that these processes are coupled, right? The formation of the thioester bond is dependent on the oxidation of GAP through a mechanism that we just saw, right? We saw that because we're all the way back here. When this molecule, glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, is attacked by the cysteine in the active site, it will result in the formation of that thioester bond and hydride transfer NAD+. All right, hopefully you guys get that. Definitely move on. Step 7 is going to be catalyzed by phosphoglycerate kinase. We've already talked about this at great length. So this is going to be a reaction between 1,3-DPG and ADP, generating ATP and 3-phosphoglycerate. And so we've now generated 2 ATP. And now because we've invested 2 ATP and we've generated 2 ATP, we're now even Steven. I don't like the way they drew these arrows. You guys cycle with arrows? I mean, what is the delta G naught prime for this? Right, it was like we had minus 49-ish kilojoules per mole for the hydrolysis of 1,3-DPG and minus 3-ish. It should be like, minus 19 kilojoules per mole. Right? You know, we're going to scrutinize this book, right? We're not going to trust these guys. Okay, let's skip this. All right, so now we have 3-phosphoglycerate. We have 3 more steps to get to pyruvate. So let's take a look at those. So 3-phosphoglycerate is eventually going to become phosphoenolpyruvate, which is going to be awesome because we're going to get more ATP. So let's see how that works. So 3-phosphoglycerate becomes phosphoenolpyruvate, and let's just see if we can kind of rationalize what's going to happen here? I mean, this looks the same.
Doesn't it lose water to biomethane and become what's called beginning?
Well, yeah, exactly. So I just want the class to compare these two molecules and kind of see what changes are going to occur. So this is clearly carbon 1, because carbon 3 is phosphorylated. Carbon 1 is not changing. Carbon 2, as Alana pointed out, is now going to have an OH group that receives the phosphoryl group. And so that means this OH group gets the phosphoryl group and will leave a OH group here, which somehow has to disappear. And so we would expect that an OH group can disappear and form water, right? OH is almost water, it just needs a proton. So here's the first reaction, moving the phosphate around, catalyzed by phosphoglycerate mutase. And so this phosphate's going to pop over here. How does that work? Pretty cool. This enzyme has a histidine in the active site. And that histidine is normally in a state where it's phosphorylated. It has a phosphoryl group. Okay? And so what happens is our molecule 3-phosphoglycerate binds to the enzyme, and the enzyme will have an intermediate where the phosphate bound in the enzyme gets transferred to our substrate, generating this thing, 2,3-BPG. Now, you seem to remember our very own Shalja asking about 2,3-BPG, saying, hey, is 2,3-BPG relevant to glycolysis? And the answer is yes. This is the famous 2,3-BPG that stabilized the T state of hemoglobin. All right, so now we're seeing an intimate molecular link between a crazy important metabolic pathway, glycolysis, and oxygen transport. How cool is that? That is not by mistake, right? Yeah, Julian.
So the reason that this is different from an isomerization is because it's a different phosphate than the original one that was attached to.
I'm not sure. It's an interesting point. Okay, so anyways, once we have 2,3-DPG, what can happen is it can twist and turn in the active site so that now, instead of C2 being in proximity with the histidine, C3 is in proximity with the histidine. And that phosphate will now get transferred to the histidine, and now we have 2-phosphoglycerate. Now once again, and then we can all hopefully imagine that the difference in free energy between 2-phosphoglycerate and 3-phosphoglycerate is probably negligible. Now, I'm willing to bet that if we look at the delta G prime for this reaction, it's very, very similar between 2-phosphoglycerate and 3-phosphoglycerate. And so once again, I need to make sure you guys understand that this enzyme doesn't have magic powers where it will only bind to 3-phosphoglycerate and convert it to 2-phosphoglycerate. It doesn't have the ability to do that. This enzyme will be just as good at binding 2-phosphoglycerate and converting it to 3-phosphoglycerate. So ultimately, it's the thermodynamics that tells the story. And in a metabolic pathway, the thermodynamics is controlled by Le Chatelier's principle. The consumption of 2-phosphoglycerate, which will be the next substrate in glycolysis, is constantly being consumed, keeping those levels low, with the consequence that the concentration in the cell of 3-phosphoglycerate will always be higher when glycolysis is turned on. So of course, this is just my little slide reminding you about how cool biochemistry is. So now we have 2-phosphoglycerate, and the next step in the reaction is the dehydration reaction, catalyzed by enolase, generating our good buddy phosphoenol pyruvate. Phosphoenol pyruvate has a free energy of hydrolysis. roughly 60 kilojoules per mole, right? Oh, sorry, 62. Says it right there. Let's skip that. Some chemistry stuff. You know Dr. K. So phosphatidylpyruvate is going to bind to the enzyme pyruvate kinase, the final enzyme in glycolysis, that will also bind to ADP, generating an ATP and our good buddy pyruvate, the final molecule, the product of glycolysis. Cool. I also want you to notice something. When I look at pyruvate, is there more work that this molecule can do in terms of oxidation power? Yeah, it's got CH3. Well, chapter 17. Introduction. All right, so my advice to you is you guys should be able to do this. You should be able to go hexokinase. I believe this is phosphofructose isomerase. Our good buddy PFK, phosphofructokinase. What was the name of the enzyme that cuts fructose 1,6-bisphosphate? I forget. Aldose. Who said it? Talia is studying way. I love it. Talia wants her egg. GABA hydrogenase. This was some kinase, I forget the name. This was the mutase. This was phenolase, and then this is pyruvate kinase. So even though I haven't been studying, I'm just using my intuition. You know, a lot of these enzymes are named very logically, right? Did I make a mistake? No, we're good. Okay. And then, you know, I don't want you guys to memorize these molecules. I want you to be able to recognize them. You should also know the cofactors that are involved. For instance, GAP dehydrogenase is going to use NAD plus to generate NADH. And then you certainly do not need to memorize this table, but I think it's an interesting table to look at. You know, if I look at some of these reactions, look at the delta G naught prime on that aldolase reaction. Oh, it's 24 kilojoules per mole. So the delta G naught prime for aldolase is terrible. Yet the delta G is still negative. Again, showing the power of how a metabolic pathway can drive individual unfavorable reactions. And I speculated that the free energy of 3-phosphoglycerate and 2-phosphoglycerate would be the same, and you can see I was kind of right, but they're not exactly the same. So that's interesting. There's so much information here. Okay. So what's going to happen to pyruvate? There's a few different things that can happen. The most interesting thing that can happen is it's going to get converted to acetyl-CoA. The reason why I think that's really cool is because that is what enables our lineage. So acetyl-CoA is going to get further oxidized. I pointed out that there was that carbon, the methyl carbon with the 3 CH bonds. And this is going to be subject matter that we get into next Tuesday. However, we have discussed that there are situations in us, in our bodies, where we can still make ATP without oxygen, right? And so that means anaerobic, right? So how does that work? There are bacteria that can grow anaerobically. How does that work? Well, the thing you guys should be considering is that during glycolysis, one of the hallmark features is that NAD plus is consumed, right? NAD plus is consumed to create NADH during the reaction that we just discussed, GAP dehydrogenase. We have a very finite amount of these things in our bodies. So eventually we're going to run out of NAD plus, and thus glycolysis would shut down. In the absence of NAD plus, or in very low levels, GAP dehydrogenase activity stops. It needs that molecule to do its thing. So there are a couple of different pathways that are known to exist that recycle the NADH that is generated during glycolysis, returning it to its oxidized NAD plus form. So in us, what happens is lactate is formed from pyruvate, and we would say that in this case, pyruvate is going to get reduced, and NADH is oxidized. And that's why, they always say, like, when you're working really hard, using your muscles, you have that lactic acid burn, because your muscles just start building up large concentrations of lactic acid until eventually your muscles are just going to shut down. Now, there are other organisms, like yeast, that perform a different reaction, same idea though, same principle, to generate NAD plus so that glycolysis can continue to function anaerobically. And this is one of my favorite pathways of all time, because this is how beer and wine are made. So yay, yeast. You can imagine that Usain's muscles right now are performing insane amounts of glycolysis at that very moment. That's why he's certainly not smiling right there. So here are the reactions. So in the case of yeast, in ethanol production, there's going to be two reactions. Pyruvate is going to get converted first to acetaldehyde, catalyzed by pyruvate decarboxylase. So the CO2 group leaves. We have acetaldehyde. You can see there's the aldehyde, and that's going to get reduced by alcohol dehydrogenase, which is going to bind to NADH, catalyzing the transfer of that hydride ion from NADH to acetaldehyde to generate ethanol. Thus, NAD plus has been regenerated and glycolysis can continue. And this is the reaction going on in our bodies. And the name of the enzyme is lactate dehydrogenase. Same idea though. Basically, carbon 2 is getting reduced, forming a new CH bond. Simple. All right, so now we want to get into how glycolysis gets regulated. This is super, super important stuff. This is important for me to say. Like, we've been focused on ATP, but I've alluded to the possibility that in metabolism, there are going to be other pathways that utilize intermediates or products of metabolic pathways. So glycolysis is going to generate stuff that's also important for the synthesis of fat, of a molecule called fatty acids. And so glycolysis is going to have to be regulated as a consequence. And additionally, the example I gave earlier is a good one too. And so the enzymes that are going to be involved in regulation are going to be the ones that release the most free energy. And so you guys can simply just go back to this table and figure it out. Hexokinase, minus 33.5 kilojoules per mole. PFK, phosphofructose kinase, minus 22. And then pyruvate kinase, minus 16. Nothing else here comes close. There's your answer. Those are going to be the master points of regulation. Why? Because they release a lot of free energy. And they release a lot of free energy, making the reverse reaction highly unlikely. Just throwing it in. So how is this going to work? How does regulation work? Well, some of these enzymes are allosteric, right? So they're going to be allosteric effectors that, as we have talked about and studied, will stabilize the T state if it's a negative regulator, or the R state if it's a positive regulator. There's also going to be post-translational modifications, in this case phosphorylation, which, as we've discussed in quite some detail, can either be activating or deactivating. Depends. And then last but not least, the amount of the enzymes can also be regulated at the level of transcription. But as I told you guys over and over again, it's really more at the level of protein stability, because proteins can be rapidly ubiquitinated and degraded. Okay, so another interesting thing about regulation is it can be specific to where in the body the enzyme exists. You can imagine that our muscle cells have different needs in other parts of our body. So in the book, in chapter 16, we compare and contrast muscle cells with liver. Your liver is a very, very important organ. I didn't realize just how much your liver really does until I started teaching this class. So believe me when I say be kind to your liver. It does everything. But they're really different things. Muscle cells are responsible for doing work, right? So ultimately, muscle cells need to be regulated in the sense of, is ATP around or not? If ATP is around, the muscles are going to be able to do stuff. If ATP levels are low, the opposite is true. And we're going to want to make ATP. Whereas in liver, it gets a lot more complicated. All right, so let's get into it. PFK, the main control point for glycolysis. Why? Because it catalyzes the main committed step of glycolysis. Remember, glucose being converted to glucose 6-phosphate by hexokinase. Looking at table 16.1 suggested that this was even more committing. But we have to remember that the product of this reaction is used in a variety of other metabolic pathways. And so if we shut down hexokinase, we're not just affecting glycolysis, we're affecting other metabolic pathways too, and that's why that's not the major control point. Instead, PFK is, and it is going to be inhibited by ATP. Ultimately, that makes sense, right? Ultimately, the major purpose of glycolysis is to generate ATP. I said it's also important for other stuff, but the main point of running glycolysis is to convert fuel to ATP. So if ATP levels are good, if I've got a ton of ATP, why would I want to make more? So that's why the cell will inhibit PFK in the presence of high ATP. What about low pH? How does that make sense? Why low pH? Well, if I got it. Rhetorical question. Maybe because lactic acid is an acid. And so if glycolysis is going big, generating tons and tons of pyruvate, And that pyruvate is getting converted, at least in part, to lactic acid. That will reduce the pH of the cell. It's activated by AMP. That makes complete sense. That's just the converse of what I just said about ATP. This learning check is just covering what I just told you, why hexokinase is not the committed step of glycolysis. Okay. Now we're going to talk about regulation of glycolysis in the muscle. So let's first talk about hexokinase and pyruvate kinase. Hexokinase is inhibited by what? That's just simple feedback inhibition. This also sets up the communication between phosphofructokinase and hexokinase. When PFK is inactive, well, that means that its substrate level will increase, fructose 6-phosphate, which is readily reversibly isomerized to glucose 6-phosphate, and that will ultimately inhibit hexokinase. Pyruvate kinase is inhibited by ATP, makes a lot of sense, same logic as what I said earlier. Then it's also inhibited by alanine. Now you guys have to realize that, again, we're talking about alanine. Why alanine? And that's an amino acid, right? And so, again, remember that things like pyruvate are utilized by other metabolic pathways. So we could speculate that maybe pyruvate is actually involved in the generation of alanine. So if alanine is plentiful, then that's another way of the cell telling pyruvate kinase, hey, I don't need any more alanine. So again, you got to remember that there are multiple things going on during metabolic processes that are so complex, like glycolysis. Pyruvate kinase is stimulated by the product of PFK, phosphofructokinase. Okay. So this is kind of a nice summary slide, explaining how our three enzymes that regulate glycolysis, how those enzymes are regulated during two different physiological states in a muscle cell. At rest or during exercise. You got to remember that during exercise, ATP is being consumed. Whereas at rest, less ATP is consumed. So basically, the book is speculating that at rest, ATP synthesis is less necessary. And so glycolysis will be inhibited. So hexokinase was inhibited by glucose 6-phosphate. PFK is inhibited by ATP, as is pyruvate kinase. Then now let's go over to this situation where ATP synthesis is necessary. Here, AMP is stimulating phosphofructokinase, and fructose 1,6-bisphosphate is stimulating pyruvate kinase. So there's a logic to this. I mean, some of it requires some memorization, and you really have to remember that hexokinase is inhibited by its product, that's called feedback inhibition, whereas pyruvate kinase is stimulated by fructose 1,6-bisphosphate, which is feed-forward activation or stimulation. So now let's switch over to what's happening in liver cells. So one of the functions of your liver is to act as a glucose storage depot. So what happens is glucose is stored as a polymer called glycogen. And so ultimately, when supplies of glucose are low around the rest of our body, the liver is going to sense that and be able to deliver glucose to the rest of our body through our circulatory system. And so the enzymes of glycolysis, which consume glucose, need to be aware of that, right? They need to be sensitive to that. So phosphofructokinase is not only inhibited by ATP in liver, but also by citrate. And so why citrate? And so you have to just imagine, what does citrate actually do? And is citrate involved in energy metabolism, or is it involved in the storage of glucose? I'll give you a hint. We'll find out about this guy in chapter 17. Let's keep going. Let's talk about phosphofructokinase more. Definitely going to respond to changes in glucose concentrations in the blood. That is very obvious because that's what's regulated, right? It senses when glucose concentrations in the blood gets low. Also, this molecule, fructose 2,6 bisphosphate, is an activator of PFK in the liver. I want you guys to make note that this is not an intermediate of glycolysis. Interesting.
How's it called?
I don't know. Somewhere. There's some enzyme that will catalyze the formation of this. And I think my slide kind of points out what's happening. So what's going to happen in liver is fructose 6-phosphate levels go up when glucose goes up. That makes sense. That's just glycolysis, right? So in liver, there's an enzyme that will take this fructose 6-phosphate and generate fructose 2,6 bisphosphate. Okay? Now, Alana and everyone else, I would speculate that the purpose of fructose 2,6 bisphosphate goes beyond just activating this enzyme. But it's a way for the enzyme to sense whether glucose is plentiful. So the binding of fructose 2,6 bisphosphate to PFK increases PFK's affinity for substrate. It also diminishes the inhibitory effect of ATP. So if I ask you guys, even though we're not doing this, sadly, if I had a question on the exam where I said, speculate on how fructose 2,6 bisphosphate binding to PFK increases PFK's affinity for substrate, what would you guys say? Huh? Almost. Cooperative binding. That's not exactly the right answer. Go ahead.
Would it drive the reaction forward and diminish the amount of products, or would
That's restating what I just told you. Come on, guys.
I want to say allosteric, but again.
You're so close. How do you have cooperative binding? That's what we're trying to address. Go ahead, Chelsea. Homotropic factors, but structure. Think of the structure. The T state and the R state. That's how this works. Right? We're talking about an increase in PFK's affinity. What state of the enzyme, of an allosteric enzyme, has high affinity binding for substrate? The R state. Right? So you guys see how that works? And do you see the difference between my answer and what you guys were saying? We're saying no. Yes? Better answer. Okay, moving on. And it diminishes the inhibitory effect of ATP. So what does ATP do? It stabilizes the T state. We imagine that PFK is an allosteric enzyme with multiple subunits capable of adopting either of these two conformations. The binding of ATP to a regulatory site would stabilize the T state. So the principles of what we've already learned applies across the board. Hope you guys see that. Okay. Now let's just talk about hexokinase in liver. There's actually a different enzyme in liver. It comes from a different gene. It's an isozyme. So we don't even call it hexokinase, even though it has the same function as hexokinase does in muscle cells. In liver, the isozyme is called glucokinase. Now, the reason why liver cells make this thing is because the isozyme has a lower affinity for glucose than does hexokinase. That's cool because it gives muscle cells dibs on glucose first, right? And so there's a physiological explanation for that, right? Our muscle cells are the ones that really need this stuff the most. And then once they're satiated, if glucose is so plentiful that our muscle cells take glucose out of blood and there's still glucose left, then liver gets to do glycolysis. Another interesting thing that was really scary is that glucokinase is not inhibited by glucose 6-phosphate, right? So there's no feedback inhibition.
Can you repeat that?
What?
Can you repeat that?
There's no feedback inhibition in liver cells because glucokinase is not inhibited by glucose 6-phosphate. And so we can rationalize this too. We can think to ourselves, well, why is that? Well, again, we have to imagine what liver cells are doing that's different. Right? And the first thing that comes to my mind as a biochemistry instructor is I know that glucose 6-phosphate is a substrate for generating glycogen, the molecule that stores glucose in liver cells. Pyruvate kinase, same deal. There's isozymes that are different in muscle and liver cells, and there's even an isozyme specific for your brain. And so here, the allosteric regulation by these various factors we're discussing, ATP, AMP, alanine, those are similar. Where these things are different is in terms of covalent modification. The L form is controlled by phosphorylation, whereas the M form is not. Again, telling us that liver regulation is more complicated. And so our cells have evolved, liver cells have evolved to take into consideration that things are more complicated in the liver than in muscles. So you see a higher degree of regulation because of it. And this slide is just explaining that there is that the phosphorylated form of pyruvate kinase is less active than the dephosphorylated form. So there's some other kinase out there that senses in liver whether glycolysis should be turned on or not. If it senses that glycolysis should be turned off, then that kinase binds to ATP, binds to pyruvate kinase, transfers the phosphate group, and the enzyme is inhibited. But that's reversible. There's going to be a phosphatase enzyme that can remove that phosphate, regenerating the enzyme that's active. I know I'm going super fast, and so what I want you guys to be able to do is go through those slides, go through the chapter, and you should be able to make your own tables, right, that summarizes everything that we discussed for these 3 critical enzymes of glycolysis, I want you to be able to understand how they're regulated both in muscle cells and liver cells, and I want you then to compare and contrast how that works. And then I'm literally down to 1 last minute. We are obviously not going to discuss gluconeogenesis, meaning that you are responsible for learning about this on your own. I want to make one critical point. Gluconeogenesis is not just a reversal of glycolysis, because the delta G for glycolysis was largely negative. It was like almost minus 100 kilojoules per mole. So trying to go in reverse